Oh, hey everybody. I think I'm live now. Good. So I'm going to give you a bit of an update on this site, Swartigill. It's an Iron Age site that we have been excavating, and by we I mean University of Highlands and Islands, Orca Archaeology, and the Yarrows Heritage Trust. The site is in Caithness, just a short bit shy south of Wick at near Thrumster. So this is just setting the scene a little bit for you here. Sorry. Go back a wee bit. So this is the landscape which the site at Swartigill is set within. It's just on the edge of the Yarrows Heritage Area, which is quite a large area of mixed moorland and farmland now, which has a number of prehistoric sites of significance within it. In this shot, you can see Swartigill at the bottom of the screen there, within the meltwater channel, in which the Swartigill burn is situated. And then in the wider landscape, you see in current times, this is quite a large area of open moorland with the Loch of Yarrows there in the background to the southwest. And although it appears to be a fairly empty landscape in terms of cultural heritage from this shot, the site, which you can see with the star there, is actually surrounded by quite a few significant Iron Age sites. We have the Broch at the South Yarrows, at the Loch of Yarrow there, and then around Thrumster, you have Thrumster Main and Thrumster Little, and just hidden by that little box at the top there, there's also the Broch at Tanach. So these are all Broch settlements, which is kind of bracketing the site in a certain extent. And we also have the late Iron Age site further up the burn of Swartigill, which is a WAG, a late Iron Age settlement. So although it appears hidden and it appears to be in a fairly remote area within this Iron Age setting, it's actually in the centre of quite a busy Iron Age landscape. So just to give you an idea about the origins of this project, the site was originally discovered by the Yarrows Heritage Trust when the burn itself was in spate and started to erode the banks, and structural features started to become appear in the erosion area. A small area of investigation, this was around 2007, I believe, took place, and some fragments of Iron Age pottery was discovered. So that kind of alerted the trust to the possibility that there was an Iron Age site, a significant Iron Age structure in the banks of the burn there. And so my colleagues from the University of Highlands and Islands did some geophysical survey there back in 2015, magnetometry and resistance survey, and discovered that there was potential for quite a large area of archaeological preservation. Myself and Martin Carruthers did some ground truthing of that geophysical survey and found that there was indeed quite good preservation in some areas. And so following on from that, I'll just give you a quick idea about if any of you in any doubt about how much erosion you can get from a watercourse of this type. This was just from this past season. You can see how fast the burn is running just after one night of, you can see how worried my dog is, just after one night of rainfall. So you can imagine after an entire season of heavy rain, how much damage that could do to a slightly exposed area of the site. So just move on from that. Here we go. This is an aerial photograph of the site, courtesy of my colleague Bobby Friel. This is at the end of the most recent season, 2023 season. And so you can see that we have quite a large complex of structures here. This is a site which is evolved over quite a significant period of time. And we have a dating sequence, which at this stage only partially tells us the sequence of the structures, but we're going to be expanding on that in the years to come, now that we have more samples to exploit. So the earliest area of the site is actually the area which has been most, that we know of, is the area that's been most significantly impacted by the erosion of the burn. And that's that area which is labeled F. So those early dates are around the transition between the early and middle Iron Age, around that 3rd to 4th century BC. So we're talking about a time when we have development of the Broch settlements around Caithness and in Orkney and elsewhere. And then the settlement evolves, and we can see that there's this complex of structures which are growing, and we also have evidence for possible cremation type material, which is where that label 4 is on the map there. Large amounts of cramp, fuel ash, slag, burnt bone, and carbonized material, all accumulated in that one area next to where the burn is there. And so, whether this is earlier activity, which is sort of in phase with the origination of the original layout of the structure, or whether this is stuff that's happening after some of the settlement starts to develop, we're not quite sure yet. But we're going to explore that as we go on. We have Middle Iron Age dates for some of the deposits which are overlaying some of the structures on the site, specifically that structure A, which is a passive structure. It would be similar in many ways to a souterrain. This is indicating to us that we have a sequence of archaeology which is obviously very tightly placed within that early to Middle Iron Age, and then going through to the end of the Middle Iron Age period. And then the rest of the dates that we have for the site so far are from late Iron Age reuse. In fact, you know, these 779 to 945 AD dates are from parts of the site which have likely been exploited for secondary occupation, where the buildings are more or less ruinous, and they're more like using the shells of these structures for shelters and camping. So just have a look at some of these areas of the site in a bit more detail. We have structure F, or area F, as we like to describe it on the site, which, as I mentioned, is the area which has been most significantly hit by the erosion. We only have fragments of structures remaining here. You can see that some of these buildings are actually, the fragments of these buildings are constructed from very large boulders. And although this is the earliest activity we know on the site, we think that we've got to the bottom of the site as well, because a lot of these buildings are actually constructed directly onto the glacial clay. And that glacial clay has been metalled with cobbles before they've laid these structures on top of them. So it's quite a well thought out sequence of building here. And as you can see from this photograph on the right here, there's quite a large flagstone surface throughout that area. Whether it's a flagstone surface that would have been internal to a structure, or whether it's a sort of courtyard area that's outside, that still remains to be seen. And we may not know the answer to that due to the damage to these buildings done by the erosion. But what we are recovering from around this flagstone surface and in the rubble that overlay it was huge quantities of pottery. And when I say huge quantities of pottery, there's also huge pieces of pottery as well. This is a very thick fragment of quite coarse pottery. And it's possible that some of this pottery is quite early Iron Age in date, or even earlier. But you'll see as we go through the talk that pottery is actually quite a strong theme for Swartigill at site as it progresses. This area of the site was very carefully and tightly packed with rubble at the end of its use. So it goes from being an area which is quite open to being an area which was more or less deliberately backfilled. And within that backfill, they are using the area for insertion of kists and possible other cremation type deposits. So unfortunately, this kist didn't survive very well, again, due to the burn erosion. It had been partially opened by the passage of water and partially cleaned out, but we did manage to recover some samples from within the bottom of the kist, which contain burnt bone. So we will be doing analysis on that to try and determine whether potentially these have been used for in a funerary context, or whether this is material that's washed in from elsewhere. So an area which has been sort of, again, as I say, filled in with rubble, and then within that rubble, other structures inserted. So structure A, as we refer to as a souterrain, this building has been has used the available structural remains around it, but also the deposits that have built up, and has cut into those to give it its form. And it's a very interesting structure in that it has a very well built and very substantial drain running through the center under the passage floor. You can see where we we opened up part of it through lifting one of these large tabular sandstone blocks. And within the drain itself, we discovered very sterile soils, but we recovered workstone tools and other artifacts which had seemingly been placed within the construction of that souterrain. So these are features which they are specifically selecting items to place within the construction of these structures must have some sort of significance to the builders. I'm sure Martin will be able to elaborate that on more eloquently than I can. But also within the construction of this passage on its north wall, which is more or less a very simple revetment along this side. Within the cut for the construction of that, we also recovered these beautiful minuscule blue beads. Again, fairly reminiscent of other beads from Iron Age assemblages throughout northern Britain and Scotland. This is testament to why it's important to sample everything you can, really, because without the samples that we took from the fill of that cut, these tiny objects would have been completely missed. It's just virtually impossible to see them when you're excavating. So this is building up this theme that obviously within this Iron Age site we have items and objects which have been deliberately placed with possible significance within the construction, but we're also seeing items which are indicating the possible wealth and status of the people that live there as well. So one of the themes that I want to touch on as well, I'll just go back for a second, is you can see that these structures, go back, these structures are in many ways interconnected. And as you would expect to see in many Iron Age sites from early Iron Age into Brock settlements and later Iron Age sites as well, there's usually connecting passageways, connecting doorways between structures. And the layout of the site here isn't something that you would, although there is no Brock at Swartigill, it's reminiscent of some of the post-Brock settlement and contemporary Brock settlements around sites like Gunness, the Cairns, and other excavated sites in the Northern Isles. So this theme of connectivity between these structures helps us to understand the phasing of their use as well. It's very likely that structure A at the bottom, the passage at the bottom of the site here, led into a courtyard area that surrounds the east side of the site, which then led into these passages that lead into structures B and D. So just fast forward to structure B, which is our kind of most complete and probably what you describe as the most reminiscent of a roundhouse type structure. Although, as you can see, it's not round; it's more kind of avocado shape, as we like to say. And it's probably likely that this building is developed through sort of evolution of different structural elements that's been brought together. So you can see the southern wall at the bottom of the site here. It's quite sinuous, and it doesn't line up with the more curving circular northern wall. So these are likely. This is likely a space which has been turned into an internal area through the modification of earlier structural features. So you can see from that image that we have quite a nice hearth setting in the center of this structure. So is very reminiscent of what you'd expect to see classic Iron Age hearths from the sort of middle to late Iron Age, curbs of edge set stone, multiple phases of use of this hearth as well. So it's not just a single use event. This is a hearth which is repeatedly repaired and with multiple layers which are forming its development. And it's fairly central within the hearth as well. This is a case that we see all the way through its development as well. It's always kind of fairly central within that structure. The depositional buildup within this structure is also quite interesting. So in the north side of the site, you can see that we have this huge dump of very orange peat ash, which covers a massive area on the edge of it. And the concentration and thickness of this peat ash, it would appear that this material that's accumulated quite quickly. But the quantity of it that's there would, this isn't just, stuff that's been raked out from the hearth. This is material that's been dumped fairly deliberately within that part of the site. And we've sampled it to death, Chris G at the back there. Thank you very much for the time and effort that you put into sampling that deposit. So hopefully, once we have analysed that material, we'll be able to get a much better idea about what the, what sort of activities associated with dumping of such a large amount of ash. The hearth itself also has a system of drains or possible flues connecting with it. You can see on that what would be the west side of the site. These two flagstone features running into the hearth, and although it's possible that these are, to keep that area of the site dry, I believe that they're much more likely to be flues to draw air into the hearth. So this is obviously to increase the strength and the heat of the temperature of the fire that's being laid in that hearth. This is, again, not uncommon within Iron Age structures, Iron Age features of this type, but perhaps points to the possibility that they're using this hearth for something other than just simply domestic activity. Within the later stages of this building, after it starts to collapse, that's not the end of its use. In the later Iron Age, in that sort of 8th, 9th century period, they are clearing the rubble to one side and again using that central area for as a hearth. And within that rubble, that's where we recovered this quite nice artifact, this whetstone, which is quite. I mean, perhaps some of my colleagues at the have more experience of Norwegian material culture will be able to correct me, but that to me has a much more sort of Scandinavian cultural feel to it, shape to it, than a lot of the Iron Age ones that we see, which are much more sort of simple stone stone bars. This one obviously would originally have had a hole drilled through the end of it, so probably hung from a thong on a belt or something like that. And again, it kind of speaks to this secondary reuse of the structure that we have these artifacts probably from a later phase of activity. One thing I almost forgot to mention was the huge spread of pottery which surrounds the hearth on the south side. So just where that lower raging rod is, basically this whole area in here was covered in pottery, and much of it showing signs of decoration. You can see, maybe just make out on that photograph that there's incised decoration in this pottery, and there's also applied decoration forming a wavy cordon. Now, this isn't, it's not particularly common, I believe, these forms of decoration, but what we have in this structure is huge quantities of it, and we'll be looking at this to see whether they represent a small number of vessels that have that have been smashed and spread in this area, or whether this is a more common theme of decoration which is over several vessels. But whatever the situation, this is a large amount of material that's been seemingly laid around the edge of the hearth and within the hearth. A lot of it is also quite poorly fired, so it could be that these are failed pots which are being discarded in this area. So our second larger structure, structure D, which is situated just to the south of structure B, again possibly connected through a series of passageways. When we first started excavating this structure, we anticipated that it would be quite a large roundhouse, but as is always the case, these things change as we go through. And it now appears that there's a kind of a passage area around the sort of north side of the structure right at the top of the screen, and the main area of occupation is more likely within the southern part of it, which may never have been completely enclosed. There may have been an open edge on the north side. One of the defining features of the architecture in this building is that it's quite poorly constructed. There's been many attempts to repair and reline the walling at various different phases. And part of the reason for that is that a lot of the stonework within this structure is showing signs of severe heat damage. Lots of degradation of stonework, fire cracking, which is likely due to like a number of heating events, not simply a single fire which has burnt down the building, which we might expect to see most of the rest of the structure intact. This appears to be an attempt to reconstruct areas of the site of the building which have been damaged, and you can see within the complexity of the walls how they've been built here. Several phases of relining reconstruction are evident. And the reason for this heat damage is possibly evident in the size of the hearth that's in the center of the building here. You can see it's quite, again, the same as structure B. We have a very nicely laid out curve with half flagstones in the center. But we also have this unusual feature just off to the side of it, which looks to all the world like a furnace or kiln type structure. Now, we haven't found any evidence, as Sarah demonstrated in her earlier talk about the Culduthel and the cairns. We haven't found any evidence of metalworking at Swartigill. But that's not to say that this kiln may not have been used for some other kind of heat associated industry, like baking perhaps, or pottery firing. We're still in the process of sampling and excavating that feature, so we don't know for certain yet. But again, we're hopeful that a lot of the samples that we've taken this year will shed more light on that. Within the later phases of this building, where we're starting to see the infill of the structure, we're also recovering large amounts of evidence for cereal grain drying. So we have cereals of both oats and barley within the deposits overlaying the structure. So this is probably evidence for, again, later reuse of the shells of these structures for activity in the sort of late Iron Age or early medieval period. So we talked about the large quantity of burning that has been going on in that structure, and that most of the structure D is surrounded by burnt stone in one way or another. In fact, it looks like part of the structure has been built into a mound of burnt stone, and what we might otherwise consider to be a sort of a Bronze Age activity, hot rock technology. But these huge quantities of burnt stone are concentrated in areas where it looks like there's other kind of material as well, such as pottery and charcoal. And it could be that a lot of the stone has been heated to use for heating water, as you'd expect to see in a Bronze Age burnt mound. But it could also be, and I think perhaps more likely, that a lot of this material is the discarded remains of wall linings and hearth linings, which have been damaged beyond use and then have been discarded around the edges of the structure. You can see from the photo of this area being excavated how dark and rich that soil is. That's because it's absolutely chock-a-block with charcoal of various different sizes. And again, we haven't done the analysis of this charcoal yet, but it's pending. But it appears to be that this material is, consists of large amounts of these smaller branch pieces. And mixed in with the burnt stone and the charcoal, large quantities of pottery. Some of it quite fine, some of it quite poorly fired. So again, we may be seeing evidence of discarding of a material which hasn't fired correctly. Off to the one side of structure D, we have this annex, which originally we entitled structure C because we thought this was perhaps an earlier feature within the sequence of structures. It's very different in its construction. It has these edge-set stones and a much more sort of rectangular set at right angles, a more rectangular setting. You can see that they've selected stone which has this fossilized lake or riverbed on it, this ripple stone, which perhaps they did it deliberately, perhaps not, but it does have quite a pleasing aesthetic aspect to it now. This building, we got to the bottom of it literally this year, and it has a very tightly packed flagstone surface at the base, obviously now very degraded, but originally would have been very tightly packed flagstones, large flagstones, creating a very smooth surface. And it's an area that was likely kept very clean in antiquity, but not very much in the way of build-up of deposits or artifacts from within this area. And it's its position just off to one side from structure D may mean that this was like a specialized area associated with whatever activity was also going on in structure D. Other structures that we have on site are likely to be later in the sequence. And again, the overlay deposits, which we've dated to that later Iron Age period, these are very simple structures, likely to be just simple small enclosures, perhaps for perhaps animal enclosures, perhaps for storage of materials, and probably more likely to be associated with medieval farmsteads, which are situated to both the north and to the south of the structure of the site at Swartigill. Similarly, structure G, which we fully excavated this year, is again a very simple structure, but appears to potentially be an annex to the later use of structure D. Very simple construction of large blocks laid almost just on top of the silty alluvial buildup of material within the floodplain. Very little in the way of artifacts, very little in the way of cultural material buildup within these structures. But we did recover from this area the northern spiral, the Guido 13B, which you may have glimpsed an equivalent of in Sarah's talk about Culduthel. Obviously, a lot of that kind of bead production happening there, and some beautiful examples of the same sort of bead from that structure, from that site. So it's not certain whether this bead was, it probably wasn't manufactured on this site. It's been broken in half. It's probably likely to have been used, reused and reworked, cold working as it's described, and perhaps discarded in the later phases of use, or washed in through this process of alluvial buildup that shrouds the site. So I mentioned the quantity of pottery that we have. We have several different forms and several different types, some of which are very reminiscent of types of pottery discovered at the excavation of Broch, just a short distance from the Swartigill site. You see that type A pottery with the thumbprint and decoration around the outside. Whether this is deliberately for decorative purposes, or whether it has a more, whether this is, as some people have argued, it's more to do with just the forming of the rim, or perhaps it's to provide better grip around the rim of the pot. It's open to interpretation. I think that it does obviously have a decorative aspect to it. But as you can see, we also have large quantities of decorative pottery within this spread of material that we're finding in structure B and elsewhere on the site. So just to put this in some perspective, and thanks to Martin Carruthers for this information, these are to give you an idea of the sort of quantity of pottery that's been found in other sites in Caithness. It's not huge quantities. I mean, there haven't been a huge quantity of middle and late Iron Age sites excavated in Caithness, but from the ones that we have, Everley at the top there being the one that's produced the largest number of sherds. Prior to our excavation this year, we had 696 sherds of pottery from Swartigill. We've, I would say, probably quadrupled that quantity from our most recent excavation. And the question is, what activity is happening at Swartigill that is, producing this quantity of material, and where is it in relation on the site? Well, it actually seems to be coming from a few very concentrated areas on the site. We have the area at the top, which is structure F, and the burn section, which is an area where a lot of this pottery appears to have been inserted into the rubble infill of that area. And this is where we're finding that majority of that material, that's that type A fingerprint and decoration around the top. Within structure B, around the edge of the hearth, those triangles don't do justice to the number of fragments that we have there, because there were so many that we had to basically record them in large contiguous groups. And that's the majority of that material is where we're having those other decorated sherds of pottery from. And then the other concentration is right at the bottom of the site, within the area where we're getting a lot of this burnt stone, a lot of this charcoal material dumped all together around the outside of structure D. And a few fragments from elsewhere as well, but not in the same sort of quantities. So there's definitely specific concentrations areas. Perhaps this is relating to depositional activity. So again, is it to do with perhaps some specific, more ritualized activity where they're inserting this material into the rubble at the top of the site? Is it to do with the fact that material has been discarded with other material, other residues which from activity, from industrial activity within these structures? Those are questions that we're going to be answering in our post-excavation process. So along with the pottery, we find large quantities of stone tools, some of which are, I mean, I hesitate to use the word coarse stone tools because some of these are quite very fine. So you see Travis there proudly holding two of the quern rubbers that we recovered this year. Quite a few quern rubbers now we've recovered from the site. So these are usually found in significant locations as well. They're incorporated into walls, into paved surfaces, into structures. So not simply discarded. They're being curated within the construction and later use of the building. Large numbers of these grinding stones as well. And you can see this possible pillow stone, which is on the right-hand side of the screen there, which, or your left perhaps, which probably used for much finer shaping and polishing of potentially for soft metal objects. So a large variety of stone tools and probably associated with some quite both domestic activity, but also some craft specializations as well. Alongside this, we have an increasingly large assemblage of items of adornment for glass, and we can add amber to that selection now as well. A fragment of amber bead was recovered from the same context as a large pottery spread in structure B from this year. Copper alloy objects, which seem to have been had originally been a fitting. You can see on the top image of that, there's evidence for a fitting there, and on that bottom one, it's a hollowed out area which probably would have held a gun of some kind, possibly from reworked glass. And we have our glass beads as well. And also these many fragments of lignite bracelet. We have 2 or 3 fragments of lignite bracelet now from the site, which again kind of help to reinforce this Iron Age context within the assemblage that we have. So, although this isn't a huge quantity of items so far, I'm sure we'll be increasing them as we continue with excavation and the post-excavation. But this is telling us that the people living there, although it's not a Broch settlement, one of these high-status settlements, these people still have agency. They still have, they're still adorning themselves in the same way that what we perceive to be these, these landowners, these more powerful people within the Iron Age society. So this settlement away from these larger Broch settlements is necessarily lower status. It's possibly a similar sort of status. It perhaps has a different type of specialism, or perhaps it has a different type of aggregated settlement development that is happening in tandem with the Brochs. So we're just going to have a quick recap to kind of have a think about what makes Swartigill a significant site within the Scottish Iron Age. I had to put in this picture of our colleague Alan Braby, who very kindly came and gave some of his time this year. We are starting to have some living history activities on site, which is always a good thing for bringing in interested people. So one of the most compelling things about the site is the rarity of early Iron Age excavated sites in Caithness. We have to build up our understanding of the development of these sites, and Swartigill is an excellent opportunity to understand that development away from the Brochs. So there's been plenty of excavations of Brochs, but not so much in the way of these non-Broch settlements. Anywhere else in Scotland as well, actually, there has been. I know this is Brochtoberfest, but there are other areas of settlement outside of those large monumental sites. And I think that we're showing with a lot of the assemblages that these are complex structures. These are complex sites with their occupants who have agency, have status. They're not simply the peripheral dregs of society that have moved away from those, or been pushed away from those centres of monumentality in the Iron Age. The quantity of pottery and the quality of the pottery from the site is also significant. Is this an area of production? Is it an area where there's some sort of specialized activity going on that requires that amount of pottery? Is the fact that there's so many decorated sherds significant in the sort of activities that are taking place with that pottery, to do with feasting or to do with other domestic activities or ritualized activities? And just to reiterate the importance of these items of personal adornment, indicating both the status of the people, but also the connection to the rest of the Iron Age society throughout Scotland, throughout Britain, and beyond as well, potentially, with evidence for some of the amber which has been traded, perhaps not directly from areas in the Balkans where we perceive a lot of this comes from, but from elsewhere and indirectly. So just to summarize, just to finish off, sorry, just to thank a lot of our sponsors. I should add that actually Caithness Archaeological Trust should be on there as well. I didn't manage to find their logo at the last minute to add on to that. But thanks to everybody who's helped to fund this project so far. We've got a lot of work to do in terms of post-excavation and analysis, and just going to wrap it up there and open up to, if we've got time for some questions, I think. Thank you. Chris?
I just wondered if you were how stay in your day before.
Chris is asking whether there's any parallels to the decorated pottery. I don't know. Martin, have you managed to find any yet?
We carbon stuff is quite familiar, but it's on a weird scale. That's the thing about it. It's a particularly broad form of applied carbon. Usually those applied carbons are much thinner and smaller and less pronounced, and it's really sinuous and really dramatic. So it's kind of like a wavy carbon style decorated form of on steroids. It's not human line, but it's gone over the top. And then that inside stuff actually looks quite like some of the Western lines, Baroque period pottery, so-called ballware in the line. And you picked up some of that stuff from Clackhall. But the funny thing is, Clackhall, being on the northwest coast of Scotland and Acid, has that proximity to the west. Whereas it doesn't look anything like the kind of standard of Northern Isles and Caithness, Northern Mainland Scotland pottery that we used to see. So there is something quite weird going on with it. But weird is interesting.
You need me to wrap up? Yep. Oh.
Can you just summarize that?
Oh yeah, I can try and summarize that. Yeah. So yes, you wouldn't have heard Martin's response there, but I shall summarize in a briefer fashion. This the wavy cordon pottery is there are some comparative pieces, but as Martin said, these sherds from Swartigill are much larger, much like wavy cordon on steroids, as he put it. So it's similar and dissimilar to other fragments. So nothing otherwise known about those kind of wavy cordons at that scale. And the incised pottery, some examples from the Western Isles, and particularly from Clackhall. There have been some examples of that incised cordon, that incised decoration from there. But not so much in the Northern Isles and in that kind of northeast area. So yes, it's interesting that we have these similarities, but also differences. So similarities in terms of the size of those cordons, but perhaps an earlier or later form of that kind of decoration. And yes, perhaps these connections to the west of Scotland, which we haven't seen elsewhere, the Northern Isles and the Northern and Caithness before. Yeah, Maggie?
I was just wondering if there's you saw the site, is there a gap? There seems to be a gap in the dates that in the 2nd century, and then there are dates in the 8th century. And then also, if there is a gap, which people were living there in the eighth,
Mhm.
ninth, and I think you even had this particular
Yeah.
yeah, so who's living there? Is it British then?
So Raggy asked whether, because there's some gaps in our dating from the site, she asked whether there had been continuous occupation throughout the site. I do actually think there is continuous occupation on the site. I think that those gaps that you see in the, well, relatively continuous, those gaps you see in the dating sequence are actually due to the fact that we haven't got round to dating a lot of the deposits yet from those earlier phases of activity in those two main roundhouses, but we will get there. But there probably is a hiatus towards the end of the Middle Iron Age. I think that a lot of those structures that we see on the site probably do date to that Middle Iron Age, so Middle Iron Age sequence, and then into the later Iron Age. And then there probably is a hiatus where there's an abandonment phase where a lot of these buildings are gradually being degraded, filled in. There's probably a lot of flooding, a lot of that alluvial materials coming in and shrouding the sites, and then they are being and then there's this later phase of reuse of the shells of these buildings, which is probably that sort of 8th, 9th century activity that we have those later dates from. And so, yes, probably a short hiatus, and then the shells of these buildings, maybe even some Scandinavian Norse contact with in that kind of early medieval period as well, given some of the material culture we're picking up from around that area. We know that area around that meltwater channel has been a popular location for both grazing and for agricultural activity all the way through until almost present day. The current landowners there reminisce about parties and barbecues they would have in that meltwater channel while the rest of the farmers and folk were out cutting peats in the moor. So that's probably activity that goes back all the way through into that medieval period and that late Iron Age period as well. It's kind of a sheltered, quite handy area to maybe set up camp for a few days while that kind of activity is going on. Yeah.
You mentioned way back in the beginning, kind of the crowd that we found like Burnside.
Yeah.
How common is it to find human activity in very close proximity to these non-rock buildings?
I think that's a difficult one to answer because we haven't excavated that many kind of non-rock settlement sites. I think that it's quite common within Iron Age context to have human remains curated within those structures, within the foundations, within the hearths, within the makeup of those buildings. I think it's not particularly well heard of, and Martin can maybe correct me on this, to find cremated remains associated with those structures. The problem that we have is that we can't say for certain yet whether those cremated remains are within that early Iron Age context. They could be from later period, or they could be material that's been cut into from an early period. We need to step up our radiocarbon dating process. We have those deposits fairly well dated, but what we don't understand yet is whether a lot of that burnt material is definitely human remain. We have to get that analysed. Tiny fragments of burnt bone, and most of the fragments just unable to be identified through visual analysis. So we're going to have to do some zoom, some zooarchaeological mass spectrometry on some of those fragments to try and look to see whether we can identify whether they're human or some other mammal. So if it is human cremation, then I think that would be quite rare, and it'd be quite important to understand that these areas are being used within a phase of activity associated with the occupation of the site as well. Any more questions? Nope. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.